He thought he was shouting at an invisible nobody, but within minutes Jonathan Whitmore would realize he had just insulted the one woman in Manhattan capable of saving his collapsing empire. The marble lobby of the Lexington Grand Hotel gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, polished so brightly that every frantic step echoed like a warning. Jonathan Whitmore stormed across the floor with his phone pressed hard against his ear, his tailored navy overcoat swinging behind him, his jaw clenched so tightly that even his assistants kept a cautious distance. At 48, Jonathan had built Whitmore Capital into one of the most feared private investment firms on Wall Street, and men twice his age lowered their voices when he entered a room. But this morning, authority was slipping through his fingers. "No, that is not what Tokyo agreed to," he barked in sharp, irritated Japanese, his voice cutting through the elegant hush of the lobby and drawing uneasy glances from wealthy guests clutching coffee cups and leather briefcases. "If they walk away now, $80 million disappears before noon." His silver watch flashed under the chandelier light as he spun toward one of his trembling legal advisors. "Why am I surrounded by people who can't read a basic international clause?" The advisor opened his mouth, then shut it again. No one wanted to be the next target. Near the concierge desk, almost invisible against the cream marble walls, stood Claire Bennett. She wore a modest beige cardigan over a pale blouse, dark slacks, and low sensible heels that made no sound when she moved. Her chestnut hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and in her hand she carried a tray with tea service and a stack of printed conference documents requested for one of the hotel's executive suites. At 36, Claire looked like the kind of woman people forgot seconds after passing her: calm, quiet, efficient, ordinary. Exactly the kind of woman men like Jonathan Whitmore never truly saw. She stepped carefully to avoid the cluster of assistants surrounding him, but one of Jonathan's sudden angry pivots sent his leather briefcase swinging backward. It clipped the edge of Claire's tray. A porcelain cup tipped. Amber tea splashed across several contract pages before the tray slipped from her hands and clattered against the marble floor. The sound cracked through the lobby like shattered glass. Every conversation stopped. Jonathan stared down at the wet documents, then slowly lifted his eyes toward Claire as if she were something offensive that had appeared solely to ruin his day. Claire bent immediately, reaching for the scattered pages. "I'm very sorry, sir," she said softly. Jonathan didn't move to help. His nostrils flared. "Sorry," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what those papers are?" Claire gathered another sheet, her fingers steady despite the dozens of eyes now turning toward her. "I can replace the copies right away." Jonathan let out a cold laugh that carried no humor at all. "Replace them?" He took one wet page between two fingers as though it disgusted him. "These documents represent an $80 million acquisition, and you think fresh copies solve that?" A few guests near the elevators exchanged uncomfortable looks. His assistant stared rigidly at the floor. Claire remained crouched, collecting the final page. "It was an accident, sir." Jonathan leaned closer, his anger no longer contained. "People who drift through serious spaces without paying attention are accidents." The sentence landed in the silent lobby with humiliating precision. Claire rose slowly, papers in hand, her expression unreadable. Jonathan snatched his phone back to his ear and turned half away from her, continuing in rapid Japanese, his tone dripping with contempt. "This is exactly the incompetence I'm talking about," he said to the executives in Tokyo, assuming the quiet woman beside him understood none of it. Decorative staff, empty smiles, and not a functioning brain in sight. One assistant shifted uncomfortably. Another looked away. Claire said nothing. She simply stood there holding the damp contract pages against her chest, her eyes calm, her breathing even, while Jonathan Whitmore kept talking, completely unaware that the woman he had just reduced to nothing had understood every single word. Jonathan continued. Pacing in tight, furious circles, his polished shoes striking the marble with clipped authority while the Tokyo executives remained on speakerphone, their measured voices growing colder with every passing second. Claire stood only a few feet away, holding the damp pages, yet he treated her as if she had already vanished. "No," Jonathan snapped in Japanese, rubbing a hand across his forehead, "I do not need another apology from your legal department. I need confirmation that Takamori Holdings is not backing out. A long reply crackled through the phone, formal and restrained, but the tightening in Jonathan's jaw revealed it was not the answer he wanted. One of his assistants, Melissa Crane, leaned cautiously toward him. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should move this upstairs to the conference suite. Jonathan shot her a glare sharp enough to stop her mid-sentence. Unless you speak fluent corporate Japanese and can salvage a merger agreement before the market opens, Melissa, do not advise me. She stepped back instantly. Around them, the lobby had resumed movement, but only barely. Guests pretended to check messages while listening. Bellman rolled luggage carts more slowly than necessary. Even the concierge at the far desk kept glancing over with nervous curiosity. Public embarrassment had a way of stretching time, and Jonathan Whitmore was too consumed by his own anger to realize he had turned a private crisis into a spectacle. Claire lowered her eyes to the documents in her hands. Tea had blurred only the top margin of the first page. The highlighted clause beneath was still perfectly visible. She read it once, then again, her expression unchanged. Jonathan was still speaking over the executives, still forcing volume where strategy was required. We already agreed to the distribution language, he said in Japanese. Do not tell me this is suddenly a matter of honor. There was another pause from Tokyo, longer this time. Then came a cool male voice, precise and offended. Jonathan's face darkened. No, that is not what I meant. But everyone could hear that it was exactly what he had meant. Claire inhaled slowly. Something about the clause, something about the phrasing he had just used, settled into place. He was not merely losing patience. He was losing the room on the other side of the Pacific. Jonathan pulled the phone from his ear and hissed toward his legal team. Why are they suddenly hung up on ceremonial language? This is a business acquisition, not a tea ritual. No one answered. No one dared. He turned back, muttering under his breath in Japanese again, careless now, speaking as though the foreign language itself gave him permission to be crueler, sharper, less restrained. An entire morning wasted by incompetence, he said. My own team is useless, this hotel staff is useless, and apparently I am negotiating with people who care more about phrasing than profit. Claire's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the damp papers. Not because she was hurt. Because she recognized the exact moment arrogance becomes expensive. Jonathan extended his hand impatiently without looking at her. Give me those. Claire placed the documents into his palm. Their fingers did not touch. Jonathan flipped through them, then cursed softly when he saw the tea stains. Unbelievable. He thrust them at Melissa. Get new copies. Now. Melissa hurried away. Jonathan dragged a breath through clenched teeth and looked directly at Claire for the first time since the spill. And you, he said, each word clipped and dismissive, if you are still standing here waiting for forgiveness, you are wasting oxygen. Several nearby guests visibly stiffened. The insult was unnecessary, which made it sting more. Claire met his eyes. There was no anger in hers, no trembling, no wounded protest. Only a stillness so controlled that it briefly unsettled even him. Jonathan frowned, as though irritated that she was not shrinking the way most people did under his voice. His phone buzzed again. Tokyo calling back. He answered instantly, already prepared to resume the battle. But before he could speak, Claire glanced once at the contract clause Melissa had left behind on the floor, then lifted her gaze toward him with quiet certainty. Jonathan did not know it yet, but in less than a minute the woman he had dismissed as wasted oxygen was about to become the only reason his company did not lose $80 million before lunchtime. Jonathan answered the returning call with visible irritation, pressing the phone so tightly to his ear that the tendons in his neck stood out beneath his collar. Yes, he said sharply in Japanese, I am still here, and I expect this misunderstanding to be resolved immediately. The response from Tokyo was colder than before, a chorus of measured executive voices no longer interested in soothing him. Melissa returned with fresh copies, but Jonathan waved her away without looking. His legal advisor stood frozen near the elevators, clutching tablets and folders like shields that could not protect them. Claire remained beside the concierge desk, silent, almost forgettable to everyone except the one man who had just told her she was wasting oxygen. Yet her eyes had not left the contract language. She had seen the flaw now. More importantly, she had heard the flaw. Jonathan was translating confidence as aggression, and in Japanese executive culture, aggression wrapped in impatience sounded dangerously close to disrespect. "Mr. Whitmore," Claire said softly. Jonathan lifted one finger toward her without turning, the universal gesture for not now. "Do not," he muttered. Claire waited exactly 2 seconds. Then she spoke again, still calm, still gentle, but this time in flawless Japanese. "Sir, if I may, they are not objecting to the distribution clause itself. They are objecting to the way you described Takamori Holdings as replaceable." The sentence landed like a dropped crystal glass. Jonathan's hand froze halfway to loosening his tie. Melissa blinked. One attorney actually inhaled audibly. Jonathan turned so slowly it felt almost mechanical, his phone still pressed to his ear, his eyes narrowing on Claire as if his mind had refused to process what it had just heard. Claire did not lower her gaze. Her pronunciation was not merely conversational. It was exact, polished, executive, the kind shaped by years inside boardrooms where one misplaced honorific could cost millions. On the speakerphone, one of the Tokyo directors interrupted immediately. "Who is speaking?" Claire inclined her head slightly toward the device. "My apologies for intruding," she replied in Japanese, but Mr. Whitmore's wording suggested flexibility where your board requires assurance of exclusivity. "I believe the concern is not legal exposure. It is perceived respect." Silence followed. Not the awkward silence of confusion. The charged silence of highly educated people recalculating everything. Jonathan stared at her, all visible anger draining from his face and leaving behind something far more unsettling, uncertainty. "What did you just say?" he whispered, but Claire had already shifted her attention to the call. One of the Takamori executives spoke again, his tone noticeably different now, cautious, intrigued. Claire answered with the smooth cadence of someone who had spent years navigating formal negotiations. She referenced subsection language, acknowledged their chairman's previous concerns about territorial dilution, and corrected Jonathan's earlier phrase by replacing it with a far more respectful strategic commitment. Each sentence was precise. Each pause deliberate. Around them, the marble lobby seemed to stop breathing. A bellman halted with a luggage cart halfway across the floor. A woman near the espresso bar lowered her coffee cup without taking a sip. Melissa looked from Claire to Jonathan and back again as if watching gravity fail. Jonathan finally pulled the phone slightly away from his ear, but he could not hang up. He could not interrupt. For the first time that morning, someone else had entered the battlefield, and she had done it without raising her voice a single inch. Claire listened to the answer from Tokyo, then gave a small nod. "Yes," she said in Japanese, "that amendment would preserve face on both sides." Another pause. Then a warmer male voice came through the speaker, this time carrying unmistakable surprise. "Excuse me," the executive said, "did you say Bennett?" Claire's expression did not change, but Jonathan's did. His brow tightened. Melissa looked confused. The voice on the phone continued, slower now, almost disbelieving. "Ms. Claire Bennett." Jonathan's fingers loosened around the device. Claire folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Yes," she answered. The next words from Tokyo made the color leave Jonathan Whitmore's face. "We were told you retired from Trans-Pacific Acquisitions 5 years ago." For the first time in years, Jonathan Whitmore looked like a man who had misplaced the ground beneath his own feet. His mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Around him, his assistants exchanged baffled glances, clearly unaware that a simple hotel staff member had just been recognized by one of Japan's most influential corporate boards. Claire stood with the same composed posture, hands lightly folded, as if none of this were unusual. On the speakerphone, the Tokyo executive continued, his once guarded tone now touched with unmistakable respect. "Ms. Bennett, Takamori Holdings still references your Osaka mediation as the gold standard for preserving executive honor during hostile acquisitions. Melissa's eyes widened. One of Jonathan's attorneys lowered his tablet and whispered, "Osaka mediation." Another shook his head in disbelief. Jonathan finally found his voice, but it came out thin. "You know these people?" Claire turned her gaze toward him only briefly. "I used to work in Trans-Pacific negotiations." "Used to work?" The understatement was so restrained it almost felt surgical. Jonathan stared at her beige cardigan, her low heels, the tea tray now sitting forgotten on the floor, as though trying to force these plain details to align with the impossible picture forming in his mind. He had spent the last 10 minutes speaking over her, dismissing her, humiliating her in front of strangers, while the boardroom legends he had been desperately trying to impress apparently knew her by name. The realization hit him in layers, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Claire had understood every insult. Every impatient remark. Every contemptuous Japanese sentence he had assumed was hidden from her. Yet she had not interrupted until the exact second his deal was truly dying. The room seemed to tighten around him. Jonathan adjusted his tie, but the movement looked less like confidence now and more like a man buying himself one extra second to think. "Ms. Bennett," the Tokyo chairman said. "Through the phone, would you be willing to clarify Mr. Whitmore's acquisition intent on behalf of his firm?" Jonathan's head snapped toward the speaker. On behalf of his firm. They were no longer asking him. They were asking her. That was when the marble lobby went completely silent again. Even the soft piano instrumental drifting from hidden ceiling speakers seemed suddenly too distant to matter. Claire did not answer immediately. She glanced at Jonathan, and in that tiny pause there was something almost unbearable for him, not revenge, not smugness, but professional evaluation. She was deciding whether he was worth rescuing. Jonathan swallowed. The billionaire who had spent 2 decades controlling rooms with sheer force of personality now stood motionless before a woman he had called wasted oxygen. "Please," he said, the word scraping his throat more quietly than he intended. Melissa turned to look at him, stunned. She had likely never heard Jonathan Whitmore ask anyone please in her life. Claire inclined her head once, then addressed the Tokyo board in smooth, immaculate Japanese. She reframed Whitmore Capital's position as a long-term alliance rather than an opportunistic purchase. She replaced Jonathan's earlier aggressive language with language of stewardship, continuity, and mutual prestige. She cited Takamori's founding family values, referenced a 1998 shareholder letter, and connected the acquisition to legacy protection instead of simple market expansion. Every sentence landed with measured elegance. Jonathan listened in frozen disbelief. This was not language fluency. This was strategic fluency. Claire was not translating words. She was translating ego, hierarchy, and corporate pride. She was speaking to the emotional architecture Jonathan had bulldozed over all morning. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Jonathan's legal team slowly began lowering their shoulders. Melissa pressed a hand to her chest. The senior attorney near the elevator mouthed, "My God." Then came the sound no one in Whitmore Capital had expected to hear again that morning, soft laughter from the Tokyo chairman, warm and approving. "Excellent," the man said. "That is precisely the assurance our board required." Jonathan closed his eyes for half a second. $80 million had just stepped back from the cliff, and he had contributed nothing to the rescue. Claire listened to the final remarks, offered a courteous formal closing in Japanese, and ended the call with a graceful nod toward the phone as though she were standing in a glass tower in Tokyo instead of beside a concierge desk in Manhattan. She handed the device back to Jonathan. His fingers trembled slightly as he took it. Claire's voice, when she finally spoke to him in English, was as calm as ever. "Your deal should be stable now, Mr. Whitmore. Assuming no one speaks over them again." Jonathan did not answer immediately. He simply stood there holding the phone, the polished black screen reflecting a face that looked strangely unfamiliar even to himself. For a man who had built a career on never appearing shaken, the silence around him felt suffocating. Melissa stared at Claire as though she were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much larger than the room. The senior attorney cleared his throat but wisely said nothing. Several hotel guests who had been pretending not to watch had now abandoned the pretense entirely. Wealth, power, humiliation, reversal. Manhattan loved nothing more than a public shift in hierarchy. Jonathan finally slipped the phone into his coat pocket and looked at Claire with narrowed eyes, but the arrogance that had sharpened his earlier expression was gone. In its place was caution. "You handled that with a level of familiarity my international team does not possess," he said slowly. "Who exactly are you?" Claire bent to lift the fallen tea tray, setting each porcelain cup back into place with the same quiet efficiency she had shown before he ever noticed her. "An employee of the Lexington Grand, Mr. Whitmore." Jonathan almost flinched at the simplicity of the answer. It sounded less like information and more like refusal. "That is not what I meant." Claire adjusted one of the damp napkins and looked up. "I know." Melissa shifted awkwardly, sensing she was standing inside a conversation she had no right to interrupt. Jonathan glanced toward his legal advisors. "Give us a minute." No one hesitated. They scattered with surprising speed, grateful for any instruction that removed them from the invisible pressure pressing down on the lobby. Within seconds, only Melissa remained at a distance, pretending to organize folders while clearly listening to every word. Jonathan lowered his voice. "Takamori Holdings does not call hotel employees by name and cite landmark acquisitions from 5 years ago." Claire gave the faintest hint of a smile, not warm enough to be friendly, not cold enough to be cruel. "No, they usually do not." Jonathan exhaled through his nose. He was not accustomed to conversations where he had less information than the other person. It made him feel unbalanced, and Jonathan Whitmore despised imbalance. "You let me stand here and make a fool of myself." Claire slid the final cup into its holder. "You were doing that quite efficiently without my assistance." Melissa looked down sharply to hide what might have been a startled smile. Jonathan blinked. The response was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it landed with more force than any shouted insult could have. For a brief second he had no defense. Claire straightened, smoothing the front of her cardigan. "I did not interrupt when your comments were personal, Mr. Whitmore. I interrupted when your shareholders were about to lose $80 million. Jonathan studied her face. There was no triumph there. No gloating satisfaction. Only competence wrapped in restraint, which somehow made the imbalance worse. People who seek revenge often reveal their motives. Claire revealed none. "Why are you working here?" he asked. It was a blunt question, but beneath it sat a deeper one he could not yet articulate. Why would someone with that level of expertise be carrying tea through a hotel lobby? Claire's eyes drifted briefly toward the towering windows where late-morning sunlight spilled across Fifth Avenue traffic. "Because quiet places are educational," she said. Jonathan frowned. "Educational?" Claire nodded. "People reveal themselves when they think no one important is listening." The sentence settled into him with uncomfortable precision. He knew instantly that she meant him. He also knew she was right. A hush seemed to fall between them despite the low murmur of guests moving in the background. Jonathan looked at the tea stain still darkening the corner of his contract folder, then back at the woman in front of him. 10 minutes ago he had reduced her to an obstacle in his morning. Now every instinct told him he was standing in front of a far more consequential mystery. His phone buzzed again with incoming messages from Tokyo, this time marked urgent and cordial. Takamori wanted a follow-up luncheon. Takamori wanted Claire Bennett included. Jonathan read the messages twice, then lifted his eyes slowly. Claire had already picked up the tray and turned toward the executive elevator as if the entire scene had simply been another task completed before noon. Jonathan took one involuntary step after her. "Ms. Bennett," he called. Claire stopped but did not turn around. Jonathan swallowed his pride, something he did not do gracefully. "I think we need to have a longer conversation." Claire paused beside the brass elevator doors, the silver call button glowing softly against the walnut paneling. For a moment she did not move, and Jonathan Whitmore found himself waiting in a silence that felt strangely unfamiliar. Men usually waited for him. Rooms usually adjusted around him. Yet this quiet woman with the tea tray had somehow shifted the gravity of the entire lobby without lifting her voice once. Claire turned slowly. "A longer conversation about your acquisition," she asked, "or a longer conversation about why you spoke the way you did when you thought I could not understand you?" Jonathan's throat tightened. Melissa looked down so quickly that her hair fell across her face, pretending intense interest in a stack of folders she was no longer reading. Jonathan opened his mouth, but no polished executive response came. Because there was none. There was no strategic framing for contempt once it had been translated back into plain truth. "Both," he said at last. Claire studied him for a second that felt much longer. Then she stepped away from the elevator and set the tray on a nearby console table. "You have 15 minutes before your Tokyo follow-up briefing," she said. "Use them carefully." Jonathan almost laughed at the absurdity of being instructed inside his own crisis, but the sound never came. Instead he nodded. They moved toward a quieter seating area near the floor-to-ceiling windows, where low cream armchairs overlooked the restless current of Manhattan traffic 12 stories below. Melissa started to follow. Jonathan raised one hand. "Not this one." She stopped instantly. Claire sat with composed posture, ankles crossed, hands resting lightly in her lap. Jonathan remained standing for another moment, as if sitting would concede too much, but eventually lowered himself into the chair opposite her. It was the first time all morning he had been forced into stillness. He disliked how revealing stillness could be. "You said Takamori referenced your Osaka mediation," Jonathan began. "That deal is still taught in international finance seminars." Claire gave a small nod. "Some universities still mention it." Jonathan stared. "You led it?" "I repaired it," she corrected. "There is a difference." Jonathan leaned back slowly. Pieces were clicking together now, each one making his earlier behavior look more embarrassing. He had heard of Claire Bennett. Not personally, but in the abstract way elite circles pass around certain names with a mixture of admiration and irritation. The negotiator who could walk into culturally fractured mergers and somehow leave both sides feeling respected. The woman who disappeared from corporate headlines 5 years ago without explanation. He had imagined someone older, severe, intimidating. Not a quiet woman in a beige cardigan carrying Earl Grey through a hotel lobby. "Why leave that world?" he asked. Claire looked past him to the city skyline, sunlight catching the glass towers like cold fire. "Because I spent 12 years watching powerful people confuse money with permission." Jonathan felt the words land directly where they were meant to. Claire continued, her tone even. They interrupted, belittled, postured, and assumed volume was the same as authority. Most never realized the deal was usually decided by how they made others feel in the room. Jonathan said nothing. Claire turned her eyes back to him. "This morning, you did not lose Tokyo because of one clause. You nearly lost them because you made everyone around you smaller in order to feel larger." The sentence struck with elegant precision. Jonathan shifted in his chair. No board member had ever spoken to him that directly. No competitor would dare. Yet because Claire's voice held no bitterness, only observation, arguing with her felt childish. "I was under pressure," he muttered. Claire tilted her head slightly. "Pressure reveals habits. It does not invent them." The air between them seemed to still. Jonathan looked down at his own hands, immaculate cufflinks, expensive watch, fingers that had signed billion-dollar restructures without trembling. Yet somehow this conversation unsettled him more than hostile shareholders ever had. He remembered every Japanese insult he had tossed carelessly into the air assuming she was beneath comprehension. Decorative staff. Empty smiles. Not a functioning brain in sight. Heat rose behind his collar. "You understood all of it," he said quietly. Claire nodded once. "Yes." Jonathan exhaled, long and controlled, but not enough to hide the shame beginning to edge into his expression. Outside, a siren wailed faintly somewhere down Fifth Avenue, then disappeared into the city hum. Inside the Lexington Grand, the polished world of wealth and appearance continued moving as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Jonathan Whitmore knew something had shifted, and when he finally looked up at Claire Bennett again, his voice no longer sounded like the man who had been shouting in the lobby 20 minutes earlier. "Then I owe you more than thanks," he said. "I owe you an apology I am not sure I know how to make." Claire did not rush to accept the apology hanging awkwardly between them. She simply looked at Jonathan Whitmore with the kind of calm that made excuses feel embarrassingly loud before they were even spoken. Morning light spilled across the polished coffee table between them, catching the faint tea stain still drying on the edge of his contract folder, a quiet reminder of how this entire encounter had begun. Jonathan had negotiated with hostile boards, outmaneuvered hedge funds, and forced billion-dollar concessions from men who considered themselves untouchable. Yet none of those victories had prepared him for the discomfort of sitting across from someone who had no interest in being impressed by him. Claire folded her hands. "Most apologies are designed to make the speaker feel lighter," she said. "Very few are designed to make the listener feel respected." Jonathan swallowed. The sentence was gentle, but it stripped away every polished corporate phrase he had been about to use. He had been ready to say, "I am sorry if I offended you," or "This morning has been unusually stressful," or "I appreciate your professionalism under difficult circumstances." Hollow executive language. Language built to smooth surfaces without examining what caused the fracture. Claire had cut past all of it. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees now, less like a chairman and more like a man forced into honesty. "Then let me try again," he said. Claire said nothing. Jonathan looked down briefly before continuing. "I spoke to you as though you were beneath acknowledgement. I spoke about you as though your intelligence was impossible. And I did it because I saw ordinary clothes and assumed ordinary worth." Saying the words aloud made them sound uglier than they had inside his head. Claire listened without blinking. Jonathan continued, slower now. "That was arrogance. Not pressure. Not stress. Arrogance." The admission seemed to take something out of him, some invisible layer of practiced invulnerability. Across the seating area, Melissa stood near a pillar pretending to answer emails, but her eyes kept lifting in stunned disbelief. Jonathan Whitmore did not self-indict. Not publicly. Not privately. Yet here he was, dismantling himself sentence by sentence before a woman he had met less than half an hour ago. Claire tilted her head slightly. "That is a more useful beginning." Jonathan let out a dry breath that might have been the closest thing to a laugh he had managed all morning. "Beginning?" Claire nodded. "Respect is not restored because someone says the correct words after being caught. It is restored when the person understands why those words came so easily in the first place." The lobby noise faded behind Jonathan like distant static. He knew she was no longer talking only about him and this morning. She was talking about habits years in the making, about entitlement refined by uninterrupted success, about the invisible permission wealth grants people to become careless with human dignity. Jonathan looked toward the windows, at the endless Manhattan movement below, yellow taxis threading between buses, pedestrians crossing with coffee in hand, everyone convinced their urgency mattered most. For the first time in a long while, his own urgency looked embarrassingly small. "You think men like me do this all the time," he said quietly. Claire answered without hesitation. "I know men like you do. No malice. Just certainty." Jonathan rubbed a hand across his jaw. "And you stay here to study them?" Claire's faint smile returned. "Among other things." He frowned. "Such as?" Claire glanced toward the concierge desk where another employee was helping an elderly couple with directions, then toward the revolving doors where a venture capitalist Jonathan recognized was berating a valet over a delayed car. "Patterns," she said. "Who says thank you to people they do not need? Who only becomes polite when a title enters the room? Who believes service means inferiority? Jonathan followed her gaze and felt a strange, unwelcome recognition. He had been every category she just named. His phone buzzed again, then buzzed once more, Tokyo executives now sending revised luncheon details and enthusiastic confirmations. Melissa hurried over with a tablet. Mr. Whitmore, Takamori has moved from tentative to fully committed pending your in-person lunch at 1 o'clock. They specifically requested Ms. Bennett attend. Jonathan looked at the screen, then at Claire. There it was in black and white. The deal he had nearly destroyed now depended on the woman he had dismissed in front of half the lobby. Melissa hesitated, then added softly, "Sir, they listed her name before yours." Jonathan stared for a beat, then slowly handed the tablet back. The room did not merely go silent this time. Something deeper settled over him, the unmistakable realization that status can vanish in a single careless conversation, and the people we overlook are sometimes the ones holding the door between failure and survival. By 12:45, Jonathan Whitmore and Claire Bennett were seated in the Lexington Grand's private executive dining salon, a room reserved for heads of state, celebrity financiers, and the kind of quiet deals that never appeared in newspapers until years later. Floor-to-ceiling windows poured silver daylight across white linen tables, crystal water glasses, and a city skyline sharp enough to look unreal. Melissa sat 3 chairs away with the legal team, but no one at Whitmore Capital spoke above a murmur. The center of gravity had shifted too dramatically for casual conversation. Claire no longer carried a tea tray. One of the hotel managers had discreetly insisted she change into a charcoal business suit from the executive hospitality reserve, and the transformation was subtle but devastating. The beige cardigan had hidden her. The tailored jacket did not. Jonathan noticed the difference immediately, though what unsettled him more was not the clothing. It was the way every Takamori executive entering the room greeted Claire first. Deep nods. Warm smiles. One elderly board member even clasped both her hands and said in Japanese, "It is good to see a disciplined mind has not vanished from American finance." Jonathan rose to shake hands, but for the first time in his career, his own introduction felt secondary inside his own negotiation. The luncheon began with formal courtesies, then moved to revised acquisition terms. Jonathan opened his folder, prepared to reclaim some control, but each time a sensitive cultural nuance surfaced, all eyes drifted to Claire. She did not dominate the discussion. That made her influence more striking. She inserted only what was necessary, translating not language now but tone, intent, hierarchy, timing. When Jonathan phrased a proposal too aggressively, Claire softened one adjective and the room relaxed. When a Takamori director hesitated over legacy protections, Claire referenced the founder's original manufacturing charter from 1972 and tied it elegantly to Whitmore Capital's continuity pledge. Jonathan watched seasoned executives nod in approval at points he had not even known required emotional architecture. 40 minutes into lunch, the lead counsel from Takamori smiled broadly and slid the amended commitment letter across the table. "Pending signatures, we are honored to proceed." Melissa exhaled so sharply she almost laughed. One of Jonathan's attorneys mouthed a silent "thank God." $80 million, restored not by force, not by leverage, but by the woman he had dismissed beside a spilled cup of tea. Pens were produced. Initials placed. Final pages turned. When Jonathan signed the commitment letter, the scratch of his fountain pen sounded strangely ceremonial, as though he were endorsing not merely a merger but his own public lesson in humility. After the final handshake, Takamori's chairman raised a crystal glass. "To Whitmore Capital," he said, then turned with a respectful incline toward Claire, and to Ms. Bennett, whose presence reminded us that true negotiation begins where ego ends. Glass touched glass around the table. Jonathan lifted his own, but the toast hit him harder than any market loss could have. Because every person in that room understood the subtext. They all knew who had nearly ruined the day, and who had saved it. Lunch concluded with warm farewells. Business cards exchanged. Future visits promised. As the Japanese delegation exited, several of them paused specifically to thank Claire again in their native language. Jonathan stood beside her, listening, absorbing each courteous nod directed past him. When the doors finally closed and the salon emptied, only Whitmore Capital remained. Melissa broke the silence first. "Sir," she said carefully, "that was the smoothest international recovery I have ever seen." Jonathan gave a faint nod. One attorney added, "With respect, we should consider retaining Ms. Bennett as a permanent consultant." Claire reached for the signed folders and stacked them neatly. "That will not be necessary." Jonathan looked at her. "Name your fee." Claire met his eyes. This was never about a fee. The legal team fell silent. Jonathan dismissed them with a glance, and within moments he and Claire stood alone beside the long table scattered with half-finished mineral water and folded linen napkins. The skyline burned bright behind her. Jonathan slid the signed acquisition folder toward her, almost like an offering. "Then tell me what this was about." Claire rested 2 fingers on the folder but did not take it. Her expression remained composed, though something deeper moved behind her eyes now, something older than this morning's humiliation. 5 years ago, she said quietly, Whitmore Capital acquired a mid-sized translation firm in San Francisco. Jonathan frowned, searching his memory. Then Claire delivered the next sentence with the same calm precision that had frozen him in the lobby, except this time the chill reached much further than business. "It was my father's company, Mr. Whitmore, and your board destroyed it in 9 days." Jonathan did not move. The executive dining salon, moments ago filled with polished congratulations and the clink of crystal glasses, now felt cavernous and unnaturally still. Outside the windows, Manhattan pulsed with its usual impatient rhythm, yellow taxis sliding through intersections, sunlight flashing against steel towers, but inside that room time seemed to narrow to one quiet woman and one billionaire who had just discovered this day had begun long before he walked into the hotel lobby. Jonathan searched Claire Bennett's face for accusation, for anger, for some trace of theatrical revenge. He found none. That absence unsettled him more than fury ever could. "Bennett Global Language Services," he said slowly, memory rising in fragments. "San Francisco. Boutique translation and diplomatic consulting." Claire nodded once. "My father built it over 30 years. Jonathan stared at the signed acquisition folder beneath her fingertips. He remembered the file now. Not because it had mattered deeply at the time, but because it had not. Whitmore Capital had absorbed the company during a regional consolidation push, stripped out its premium diplomatic staff, folded the profitable contracts into a larger logistics umbrella, then closed the independent office within 2 weeks. Efficient. Legal. Financially smart. He had called it streamlining. "Your father refused our restructuring terms," Jonathan said, hearing even as he spoke how bloodless the sentence sounded. Claire's eyes held his. "He refused to fire people who had been with him for decades simply to make a quarterly report look cleaner." Jonathan looked away first. A hush settled over the long linen table. He remembered one more detail now, and this one hit harder, a note from internal counsel mentioning that the founder had suffered a medical collapse shortly after the closure announcement. Jonathan had skimmed it between airport meetings and moved on to the next acquisition packet. Numbers replace names quickly at his level. "He died 6 months later," Claire said, not dramatically, simply placing the fact into the room. Jonathan's shoulders stiffened. Claire continued in the same measured tone. "Not because of one board vote alone. Life is more complex than that." But he spent those 6 months watching loyal employees lose careers they had spent years building, all because people in expensive offices decided human continuity was less valuable than a cleaner spreadsheet. Jonathan felt the air thin in his lungs. There it was, the full architecture of this morning. Not a random lesson. Not an accidental encounter. A circle closing with almost unbearable elegance. "You came here because of me," he said quietly. Claire shook her head. "No. I came here because the Lexington Grand hires quietly and asks few questions. Seeing you today was coincidence." Jonathan blinked. Somehow that made it worse. Fate had not arranged a trap. His own habits had walked him into one. Claire slid the signed Takamori folder fully toward him now. I did not save your deal to humiliate you, Mr. Whitmore. Jonathan looked up. Claire's voice remained calm, but each word carried the weight of years. I saved it because becoming careless with someone else's future is contagious, and I refuse to become what hurt my family. The room went silent in a way Jonathan would remember far longer than any boardroom. Applause. There was no grand speech left for him, no billionaire authority to reclaim, no clever defense polished enough to survive that sentence. He looked at the woman in the charcoal suit, the woman in the beige cardigan, the woman he had dismissed beside spilled tea, and for the first time in a very long career he saw the true cost of treating people as peripheral. It was not just moral embarrassment. It was blindness. The kind that makes a person powerful in numbers and impoverished in judgment. Jonathan lowered himself slowly into one of the dining chairs as if his knees no longer trusted certainty. Claire, he said, her first name sounding unfamiliar and small in his mouth, I cannot undo what happened. Claire gave a faint nod. No. You cannot. Jonathan swallowed. But I can remember this. Claire picked up the empty water glass nearest her and set it back precisely in line with the others, a tiny habitual gesture of order restored after disruption.